everyone. Mishnah Berurah here. So we're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Shofar. Today, Mirz Hashem, we'll be learning Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis. Now, we began to speak yesterday about a shofar that was punctured, a shofar that developed a hole. We're continuing to learn Siman Tavkuf Pei Vav Sif Zayin. So I just want to pick up, want to just go over what we said yesterday. Yesterday we said if a shofar has a hole in it, if you don't attempt to seal it at all, if you leave it with the hole, then the Mechaber said the shofar is kosher. The Ramah said it would be better not to use such a shofar if you have another shofar that you could use to blow with. Now, what happens if you try to seal the hole? Then it depends what kind of material you used to seal it. Well, we said yesterday, beginning on the bottom of Nun Tes Amud Aleph, we said if you seal up the shofar with something which is non-shofar material, let's say some sort of glue or a sealant, the Mechaber said even if the voice of the shofar, the sound of the shofar, is going to be exactly the same after you seal it, which means so that the sound of the shofar goes back to exactly what it was before it ever became punctured. Still in all, the Mechaber says pasal, that shofar is pasal, afilu nishtayr by rubai. So over here in this halachah that we learned yesterday, the Mechaber said you have a shofar that became punctured. You decided to seal it, and you used non-shofar material in order to seal it. Says the Mechaber, even if the sound of the shofar goes back to exactly the way it used to be before the shofar was ever punctured, and even if you still have roiv of this shofar, which is undamaged, it has no puncture, no anything else, still the shofar is going to be puzzle. And the Mishnah Berurah told us that the reason the shofar is puzzle is because when you went ahead and you sealed it with something that was she'enoi minoi, when you sealed it up with something which is non-shofar material, now when you blow the shofar, you're not hearing the coil of the shofar, you're hearing the coil of the shofar together with this non-shofar material that you used to plug up a hole. And that shofar is going to be puzzle. Not only that, the Mishnah Berurah also told us in Ois Kat Mechav Tes, on Nun Tes Amud Beis, near the top of the Mishnah Berurah, even if you seal up the hole with shofar material, which is the halachah that we're about to discuss now, even if you seal it up with shofar material, still in all, if the sound of the shofar is different, then that is also going to be puzzle for a very similar reason. It's going to be puzzle because we're going to say that the sound that you're hearing now is clearly not the natural sound of this shofar, because it has a plug, and that plug is changing the sound. So you're not hearing the natural sound of the shofar, and the Mishnah Berurah says it's puzzle. So now let's go to the Mechaber on the top line of Nun Tes Amud Beis. V'im stamai b'minoi, if you sealed up the puncture in the shofar using shofar material. So then the Mechaber says, im nishtaya rubai shalem, if roiv of the shofar is undamaged, it's completely whole, with no holes, v'loi ikvu hanikavim shenistemu es hatakia, and the puncture that you have sealed up is not changing the sound of the shofar at all. Ella rather, chazar kailoi likamoi shahaya kaidim shenikev, the sound of the shofar is now exactly the way it originally was, then kosher, then this shofar is kosher. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut Lamed Aleph. Im nishtayr, if you have roiv of the shofar, dim loy nishtayr rubai shalem, if you don't have a majority of the shofar physically intact, pasal kulei alma, then everybody would agree that this shofar is pasal, afilu sasam b'minoi, even if you plugged up the puncture with shofar material, the koiloi k'may shahaya tchila, and the sound of the shofar returns back to the way it originally was. Still in all, if roiv of the shofar is not undamaged, then it's still puzzle. Desu batal mimena shem shofar v'lo nasa shofar el al yidei stimazu. Because if roiv of the shofar is damaged, so if you have roiv of the shofar has holes and sealant in it, then that's not called a shofar. It's roiv of the it's not called a shofar anymore because the roiv of the shofar is damaged. V'nimtza dehavi shofar v'davar acher. And now when you blow in it, you're not blowing in a shofar. You're blowing in a device which is partly a shofar and partly not a shofar. Rubai shalem, if you do have roiv of the shofar intact, if the majority of the shofar from the mouthpiece and going up, if the majority of the shofar is intact, then you're okay. Continues the Mechaber, and the Mechaber says, however, on the third line, if you're lacking any one of these three factors. What are the three factors? So again, the three factors that the Mechaber gave in this case are, you filled up the hole with shofar material, the sound of the shofar has returned back to the way it originally was before it was ever punctured, and roiv of the shofar is undamaged from the mouthpiece going up. If you're missing any one of those three factors, then the Mechaber says puzzle, then the shofar is puzzle. And again, this is following the sheet of the Rambam that the Mishnah Berurah spoke about yesterday in his Hakdama in Ois Katan Chav Vav, where the sheet of the Rambam is you need all three of these factors in order for a punctured shofar to be kosher. Either, according to the Mechaber, you don't attempt to seal the puncture at all. Just leave it alone. The hole itself does not passel the shofar. But if you try to seal the hole, then there are three factors that are required in order for the shofar to be kosher. You need to seal it with shofar material. It has to be minoi. You need to have roiv of the shofar is intact. And you need to have... you need minoi. The voice of the shofar the sound of the shofar has to go back to the way it was originally, and roiv of the shofar has to be intact. You need all three of those factors. If you're missing one, according to the Rambam, then the shofar is puzzle. Continues the Mechaber in the middle of the third line. Ve'imu shasat chak. However, if we have a shasat chak over here, shein shofar acher motzui, where you don't have another shofar to blow with, then the Mechaber says yesh lahakshir. Then you could be makshir a shofar bistamai b'minoi, if you sealed up its puncture with shofar material, im nishtaya rubai, if roiv of the shofar is intact. So far you have two positive factors. You have that you sealed up the hole with shofar material, and roiv of the shofar is intact. Afilu lo chazar kailoi l'kamay shahaya, even though the sound of the shofar doesn't return back to the way it was originally before it became punctured. Because this is based on the sheet of the Rush, who says we only need two of these factors. The Chain similarly continues the Mechaber, yesh lahakshir, you could also be makshir the shofar, bistamai shaloi b'minoi, if you sealed it up with non-shofar material, if you have the other two positive factors. Im nishtaya rubai, if you have roiv of the shofar is intact, the chazar kailoi l'kamay shahaya b'tchila kaidim shenikev, and the sound of the shofar went back to the way it was before it ever became punctured. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Lamed Gimel, Shasat Chak, if you have a Shasat Chak, Ritzayin Eloimar, what the Mechaber wants to say here is, I missed a line there. Shasat Chak, says the Chavetz Chaim, V'davka shalei niskar ad Yom Tov. When we say that there's a Shasat Chak, we're talking about where you didn't remember before Yom Tov. Da'az also litar lastima, and now that it's Yom Tov, you can't remove the plug. Because if you were to remove the plug to have a ketikin kli, that would be the isser of misakin moneh. Your mamish repairing a keli on Yom Tov, which is usser. Kevin chayidei zeh makshir ha-shofar. Because remember, the Mechaber holds that the hole itself doesn't passel the shofar. So if you have this shofar and the shofar has a problematic plug in it, really, if it's before Yom Tov, you should remove it. If it's Yom Tov, you can't remove it because of Tikkun Moneh. And then we could follow, because it's the Shasat Chak, we could follow the sheet of the Rush, and we could go ahead and we could be makshir the shofar based on the other two factors. Avalim Nizkar Kaidim Yom Tov, but certainly if you remember before Yom Tov, Yitar Lastima, remove the plug. V'dinoi kilo loistamai, and then it's like a punctured shofar that you didn't attempt to seal. The kosher, which we learned according to the Mechaber, is kosher. Ois Katan Lamed Daled, the Mechaber said that a Shasat Chak means she'ein shofar achar motzui. You don't have another shofar readily available. Avalim yochel lahasig shofar acher. However, if you can get your hands on another shofar, afim kvar taka b'shofar, even if you already blew shofar, using a shofar sheyesh by tarti lamalayusa that only had two positive factors. For example, it had a plug that was minoi and you had roiv, so you have two positive factors, but the coil is not the same. So that's only kosher according to the Rosh, not according to the Rambam. If you blew shofar using such a shofar, and now Rosh Hashanah afternoon you find another shofar, yachzor v'yiska, you should go and you should blow over again, v'lo yavarech, without making a bracha. Ois cotton lamed hey. The Mechaber said that we could be machshir the shofar yesh lahachshir. Why is it that in these cases where we only have two positive factors, we could say the shofar is kosher? The samchinan al paiskim, because we rely on the paiskim like the Rosh, the Savri who hold the heiche the iketartel tivusa, that when you have two positive factors, sagi, that's enough. Vayin b'Prima Gadim, take a look at the Prima Gadim. Shekosav the nearest yuchal avarech. The Prima Gadim says you can even make a bracha in such a case. We find that the Pri Chodesh and the Gra say that the Ikar Halacha really follows the Rosh, so certainly in a Shas Chak you could use such a shofar and even make a bracha. The Mechaber said you could also be machshir a shofar that you sealed with non-shofar material as long as you have roiv. Right, as long as you have roiv and the sound goes back to the way it originally was before it was punctured. Because again, you have two positive factors. The sound of the shofar went back to the way it originally was, and you have roiv. The only problem is that you have a problematic plug because it's non-shofar material. So you have two positive factors, one negative factor. The Mechaber said you could, Shasat Chak, you could follow the Rosh and you could be machshir that shofar. But if you don't have the majority of the shofar intact, then even if you have the other two positive factors, even if you have the other two positive factors, where the plug is shofar material, and the sound of the shofar has returned to the way it originally was, still loy mahani. Even according to the Rosh, you can't be machshir this shofar because you still have one negative factor, which is that you don't have roiv. And that outweighs the two positive factors, even according to the Rosh. Afla de'azu, when we tamshe kasavnu lamala, for the reason that the Mishnah Berurah said above on this page in Ois Katan Chavtes, because over here, what did he say? If you take a look, in my Mishnah Berurah, it's the top line of the Mishnah Berurah here on the Tes Amid Beis. V'chein kishestabay b'minoi. If you plugged up the shofar using shofar material, so that's one positive factor. No, I'm reading the wrong one. Sorry, give me 1 second. No, it is. You should start with me. No, I'm referencing the wrong Mishnah Berurah. So again, over here in this case, the Mishnah Berurah is talking about a case where you have two positive factors. One is you stamai b'minoi, you sealed it up with shofar material, the chazar kailai liyos tzalol kibetchila, and the sound of the shofar is clear the way it originally was, kaidim shenikev, loy mahani afla deyazu. This does not work. Umitam shekasavnu lamaila. Yeah, because you don't have roiv. And since you don't have roiv, rubai kikulai, and you don't have a shofar. Right. Ois Katan Lamed Aleph. I'm sorry for the confusion. Ois Katan Lamed Aleph above in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go back to Ois Katan Lamed Aleph. The Mishnah Berurah said there, if you go a few words in, Afilu sasam b'minoi v'koiloi k'may shahaya tchila. Even if you sealed up the puncture with shofar material and the sound of the shofar returns to the way it was originally before the puncture, it's still puzzle, even according to the Rosh. Why? Desu batal mimena shem shofar. Because if you don't have roiv of the shofar intact, it's no longer called a shofar. Rubai kikuloi. And roiv of this shofar is damaged. V'loi nasa shofar ela yedei stimazu. Okay. Continues our Mishnah Berurah over here, Ois Kat Lamed Vav. V'heicha de'ika ruba l'chud. If the only positive factor that you have is that roiv of the shofar is undamaged, or the only positive factor that you have is that you plugged up the hole using shofar material, but v'yesh loy safek al hastima im chazak kaila l'kamoisha haya oloi. So you have one of the other positive factors. You have roiv, or you have that the plug is shofar material. Now, if you have the second positive factor, that the sound of the shofar has returned to the way it was, then you have a kosher shofar, according to the Rush, and you could use it b'shas adchak. But what if you're mesupik? You don't remember exactly what the sound of this shofar was, and you're not sure, did the sound of the shofar go back to the way it was or not? Which I could very likely imagine such a suffix. Then the Chavetz Chaim says, Yesh lahachmir midina, we should rule stringently and not use such a shofar to a sveika da'araisa, because we're dealing with a suffix da'araisa. Okay, so to this point, we have discussed a shofar that became punctured. And I think a summary would be, number one, according to the Mechaber, if a shofar gets a hole in it, a hole in the shofar does not passel the shofar. If it got a hole, even if the sound of the shofar changed, the shofar is kosher. The Ramah said, if you have a different shofar, you should use that shofar, because there are shittas that say that a shofar with a hole in it is puzzle. So if you have a different shofar, you should use a different shofar. And also, if roiv of the shofar would have holes in it, it would be puzzle because of what we just said, rubai kikulai, and you don't have a shofar. That's the first thing. Then we have this question of if you try to seal the shofar, if you try to plug the hole. So trying to plug the hole creates a difficulty. If you would have left the hole alone, you'd be okay. But now you went ahead and you plugged it. So now it depends. What did you plug it with? Did you plug it with shofar material, or did you plug it with non-shofar material? In the first opinion, which follows the sheet of the Rambam, the Mechaber says, if you plug it with non-shofar material, even if you have the other two positive factors, even if the sound of the shofar went back exactly to the way it was before, and you have roiv of the shofar is perfectly intact without any holes, according to the Rambam, that shofar is puzzle because you need all three positive factors. If you plugged it with shofar material, so then it depends. If you plugged it with shofar material, if the sound goes back to the way it was before it was punctured, and you have roiv that is not punctured, then you're okay. That's the first opinion brought by the Mechaber based on the Rambam. Then the Mechaber told me, in a shas adchak, you could get away with 2 out of the 3. If you have roiv of the shofar is intact, and you have one of the other positive factors, either the sound of the shofar returned to the way it was before it was punctured, but you sealed it with non-shofar material, b'shas adchak, that's okay. Or if you have roiv and you sealed it with shofar material, but the sound of the shofar did not go back to the way it was originally, again you're okay. If you have that you plugged it with shofar material and the sound went back to the way it was originally, but you don't have roiv, then l'kulei alma it's puzzle. I think that's a summation of this sif. Now we go to sif ches. Instead of talking about a punctured shofar, now we're going to talk about a cracked shofar. Says the Mechaber, Nistak la'arkoi. The truth is I have to bring a shofar to my desk here so that I could show you what it is that we're speaking about. Nistak la'arkoi. If the shofar became cracked along its length, so not around, to its width, it became cracked along its length. Nistak la'arkoi. The shofar became cracked along its length. Says the Mechaber puzzle. The shofar is puzzle. Now let's see right away. Zayin says the Mishnah Berurah. Nistak. V'dafked nistak. A crack is a problem. A hole, the Mechaber said, is not a problem. A crack is a problem. Also says the Mishnah Berurah, V'dafke nistak, a crack is a problem. Why? Because the nature of a crack in a shofar, it's like a windshield. You know when you get a star in your windshield from a pebble, you know that nine times out of 10, that crack is going to start developing. It's going to lengthen and lengthen and lengthen, sometimes in a very short period of time. So too, we're going to see that we expect that when we have a crack in a shofar, when you blow the shofar, the pressure on the shofar is going to cause that crack to lengthen. Now, the point of the Mishnah Berurah over here is, when the Mechaber says that a crack is puzzle, v'dafke nistak, a crack is puzzle, the halachu meisif ukidul kamei, because we're worried that the crack is going to expand, like we're going to see later. Avo benifkam, but if the shofar has a piece broken off of it, kosher b'kolshu. If it's a tiny piece that's broken off the shofar, that's kosher, because the piece that's broken off doesn't passel the shofar. Especially if it's a kolshu, if it's a tiny piece that's broken off, we might have to see some details in this halacha. But nifkam, if there's a little piece of the shofar that's broken off, that doesn't passel the shofar. And we're not afraid that it's going to expand. A crack is a problem because we're afraid it's going to expand. Nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, even though I'm telling you that nifkam is not a problem, im ra'o kaidem Rosh Hashanah, if before Rosh Hashanah you noticed that a piece was broken off, taiv yosel l'saknai, it would be better that you should repair it. Shalayiyah nira pagum, it shouldn't look like you're blowing with a broken shofar. The Mechaber said that a cracked shofar is puzzle. V'dafka b'nistak me'ever le'ever. When we say that a cracked shofar is puzzle, that's if the crack travels throughout the thickness of the wall of the shofar. That's what it means by aver le'aver, from side to side. It means from the outside of the shofar straight through to the inside of the shofar. The crack penetrates the entire thickness of the shofar. Va'af pi she'ein by chisaron, even though there's nothing lacking from the shofar, v'gam lo nishtana kailai, and even if the sound of the shofar has not changed, it doesn't matter. A crack passels the shofar. Now we're going to see that the reason the crack passels the shofar is because if a shofar is cracked, we look at it as it's no longer a shofar. A shofar comes from the word shveiferes. A shveiferes is a tube. A shveiferes is a closed tube that is opened on one end. But if a shofar is cracked, and especially we expect that the crack is going to expand and eventually encompass the entire length of the shofar, then it's no longer a closed tube. It has a crack. Eventually, it's going to have a crack along its entire length. So then it loses the shem shofar. It's not called a shofar anymore. So even though there's nothing missing and the sound of the shofar still seems to be the same, it doesn't matter. That shofar is puzzle. Now let's see the details of this halacha. The Mechaber has told me that you should know a cracked shofar is puzzle. Okay, how much of a crack? So now let's take a look. Nistak la'arkai, if the shofar is cracked throughout its entire thickness, along its length, puzzle, the shofar is puzzle. Yei shaimrim, there are those that say, and this is a rush, b'kol shehu puzzle, that even a tiny crack is puzzle. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's Kat Lamed Tes. B'kol shehu, even a tiny crack is puzzle, lefi shamachmas haruach, because of the air pressure, the chayzik tekiah, the pressure of the tekiah blast, hasedek hoilechu meisif, the sedek, the crack, is going to travel and expand adshi yistak kuloi, until the entire shofar is cracked. The chalaimid li sadek kisadok dami, even though right now the entire shofar is not cracked, but we look at it that it is standing to be cracked. It is destined to crack along its entire the axis of its length. Why? Along its entire long axis, it's going to crack because we see a crack and it goes all the way through the thickness and it's going to be under pressure. It's going to expand, and once the entire thing is cracked, it's going to be a puzzle. So even though right now only a little bit is cracked, it's oimid, it's destined to crack totally, and therefore in halachah we look at it as if it's already totally cracked. Okay, let's go back to the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said, Yesh Omer, we have this Rosh who says, Afilu b'kol shehu puzzle, that even a tiny crack that goes through and through, and it's along the long axis of the shofar, it is puzzle. Eli in kain hit koi harbe bechut oive mishicha. Unless you used string or you used some kind of a rubber band in order to very tightly tie the shofar closed. In that case, the Rosh says, if you have only a tiny crack, so the only reason the shofar is puzzle is because we're choshish that the crack is going to expand, and therefore kala oimid lisadek kisaduk dami. But if you tie it very tightly, or you put a band around it that holds it very tightly closed, then we don't have to be choshish that the crack is going to expand. The existing crack that's there is only a kol shehu. That really doesn't passel the shofar. The only reason we're passeling the shofar is because we understand that the crack is going to expand. But if you bind it tightly, then we don't have to be concerned that the crack is going to expand, and then the tiny crack, the shofar remains kosher. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Mem, Elim Ken Hitkai, unless you attached it, meaning you bound it, Shachut Mamidoy Shaloyis Bakea Yoser, because the binding, the string or the band, is going to make sure that it won't crack anymore. Now there's a very interesting Ramah. Says the Ramah puts in a caveat to this halachah. And the Ramah says, V'nishtayir shir atakia mimokei makishira ulamaylo l'tzad. The Ramah throws in a caveat to this halachah of the Mechaber. The Mechaber said, if the shofar is cracked with a kol shehu, the Rosh said it's possible because we're afraid the crack is going to expand. Therefore, if you bind the shofar so that we do not have to be concerned that the crack is going to expand, then the shofar is kosher. Says the Ramah, it's only kosher if from the mouthpiece of the shofar until the crack, you have a tefach. You have the sheer shofar. But if the crack is within the first tefach of the shofar, from the mouthpiece going up, then the Ramah says no, then the shofar would be puzzle. Very difficult to understand exactly why this is. The crack itself doesn't render the shofar puzzle. Like the Mechaber said, a hole in the shofar is not a psul. So the crack, the tiny crack, even according to the Rosh, the tiny crack itself does not in of itself render the shofar puzzle. The only reason the shofar is puzzle is because we're afraid that the crack is going to expand. Therefore, the Mechaber said, if you bind the shofar so that we don't have to have such a concern, the shofar is kosher, because there's no concern. Says the Ramah, that's only true if you have a shear of a shofar, if you have a tefach before the crack. Ask Achronim why. Why? What's the reason for that? So there are Mefarshim that explain, give various reasons for the Ramah, but this Ramah is a difficult Ramah to understand, and therefore take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. He's cut Mem Aleph. The Mishnah Berurah says, "V'harbe achronim mekilin afilu lo nishtayir." Many achronim are mekel, and they don't go with this Ramah. And they say even if you don't have a tefach from the mouthpiece until the crack, kol zman shelo nishtana koiloi al yedei hahiduk, as long as the sound of the shofar doesn't change by virtue of the fact that you bound the shofar. When the Ramah says you need a sheer shofar, he means from the mouthpiece and going up. Later on in Sif Tes, we're going to learn about a crack that goes along the width of the shofar, and that crack has to be beyond the first tefach from the mouthpiece and going further. Okay, now the bottom line of the Mechaber. So we have one shita that says that a crack could passel the shofar even if it's only a kol shehu. However, there is another shita that says a crack is only going to passel the shofar if it runs along the roiv of the majority of the shofar. But if it's a tiny crack, it doesn't passel the shofar. Why? Umishum derubai kikulai. The first shita said even a tiny crack passels the shofar because kala oimidli sadek is sadek dami. Even though only a tiny piece is cracked, we assume that the crack is going to expand, and therefore the shofar is puzzled. This Yesh Omer, which I believe is a Magid Mishnah, the Magid Mishnah says no. A crack only passels the shofar if roiv of the puzzle of the shofar is cracked. If roiv of the shofar is cracked, so then rubai kikulai. Va'afilu im nistak rak mitzad echad. And you should know that this is true even if the crack only runs along one side of the shofar. It's not on both sides of the shofar. Avalon loy nistak rubai, but according to the Maggid Mishnah, if roiv of the shofar is not cracked, afilu loy nishtayr shir tekiya kosher. Even if you don't have a tefach section from the mouthpiece going up that's not cracked, it's still kosher. And the Mishnah Berurah says you can certainly rely on this opinion of the Maggid Mishnah in a shas adchak, because really, according to many, the opinion of the Maggid Mishnah is the ikar ledina. If you used a shofar that had a crack that was less than the roiv, and then you found a perfectly good shofar, you should blow again. However, you should not make a bracha. Continues the mechaber on the bottom line. V'im dibkoi. Let's say you had this shofar that was cracked, and you sealed up the crack. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'im dibkoi, v'davka b'devek machshirinan. It's only kosher if you use glue. Tevekilu hu shalem. Because now we look at the shofar as being complete. Because you really attached the two surfaces of the crack using a glue. But if you just bound the shofar together with a string or a band, that's not effective. Once a roiv of the shofar is cracked, so now we look at this shofar as being split. So now if you just bind it up with string or something, it's not going to be kosher. If you seal it with glue, it'll be kosher, because we recognize that as being a real attachment. Kosher. This is true so long as a tiny bit of the shofar remained uncracked. Kosher kishedibkai. If you glue up the rest of the crack, the shofar is kosher. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua for Parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Girl Tzedek B'Meher V'Yameinu. Amen.